The blizzard hit the Colorado Rockies like a freight train made of knives. Snow did not fall so much as hurl itself sideways, erasing the world in a white roar that swallowed sound and light. 8 Harley-Davidson motorcycles, black as gunmetal, disappeared one by one into the gulch below Widow's Ridge, their engines choking on ice before the riders even knew they were lost. 20 minutes later, 8 leather-clad giants materialized on Iliana Morales' sagging porch, pounding the door with fists the size of hams. The temperature had already plunged to 20 below zero, and the wind clawed at the cabin like it wanted in. Inside, Iliana's gnarled hands shook on the iron latch. Not from cold. From the knowledge that the men outside could kick the door off its hinges if they chose. One twist of the wrist and she could lock them out to die. Another twist and she could let them in and maybe die herself. She had 68 years of hard living behind her, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. The lead rider's voice cut through the storm, low and urgent, asking for mercy in a tone that carried the weight of command. Iliana closed her eyes. Somewhere in the dark behind her lids she saw her late husband Tomás nodding, the way he used to when she asked what honor demanded. She slid the latch. The door swung inward on screaming hinges. But that life-altering click of metal on metal came hours after the day had already begun its slow bleed toward disaster. Iliana woke before dawn, the way she had every morning for the 12 years since Tomás's funeral. The cabin's single bedroom smelled of pine smoke and the faint medicinal bite of the liniment she rubbed into her knees. She swung her legs over the side of the cot and winced as weight settled on joints that felt packed with ground glass. The roof overhead sagged in the middle, patched with mismatched tin that rattled whenever the wind shifted. Water dripped from a fresh leak into the enamel basin she kept on the dresser. The plink 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 counted out the seconds like a cheap clock. She dressed in layers. Long johns, flannel shirt, wool sweater with holes at the elbows, and the ancient Marine Corps field jacket Tomás had worn in Desert Storm. The jacket still carried the faint scent of his cigarettes and the desert sand he could never quite brush out of the cuffs. She buttoned it to the throat and shuffled into the main room. The cabin measured 20 by 24 feet, every inch earned by Tomás's hands and her own. Log walls chinked with moss and mud let the wind whistle through in thin, icy streams. The floorboards, once proud tongue-and-groove pine, now cupped and warped so badly that her slippers caught on the ridges. She kept a mental map of the safe path from bed to stove to door, the same way Tomás had once memorized minefields. Her pension arrived on the 3rd of each month, $1,080 wired to an account she could no longer access without driving 47 miles to the bank in town. The drive required gasoline she could not spare and tires that were bald as cue balls. So the money sat untouched, and Iliana lived on what she could stretch. $42 bought a week's worth of pinto beans, rice, canned tomatoes, and the generic oatmeal that tasted like cardboard soaked in library paste. She rationed her blood pressure pills the way soldiers rationed bullets, one every 36 hours instead of 24. The doctor in town had warned her, but warnings did not pay for prescriptions. Heat came from the cast-iron wood stove in the corner. She fed it chair legs, broken shelving, anything that would burn. The kitchen table had lost 2 legs already. She propped the corner with cinder blocks and ate standing up. Every splinter she split carried a memory. The rocker where Tomás used to read the paper, the cedar chest that held her wedding dress now yellowed and mouse-chewed. She burned the past to stay alive and hated herself for it. On the mantel sat Tomás's dog tags, polished every morning with the same soft cloth she had used on his dress shoes. Beside them hung the small American flag that had draped his coffin, its colors faded to the shade of weak tea. She touched both before she touched anything else. Ritual kept the grief from swallowing her whole. Her only link to the outside world was a hand-crank emergency radio the Red Cross had distributed after the last flood. She wound it for 2 minutes each evening and listened to static laced with distant voices. Weather reports mostly. Sometimes a preacher. Once, a missing person bulletin for a hiker who had never been found. The valley had a way of keeping what it took. Despite the scarcity, Iliana baked. Every Sunday she produced a single loaf of bread from flour she hoarded like gold. She carried slices wrapped in wax paper to the Ramirez children 3 homesteads down the ridge. The parents worked seasonal construction and were gone before dawn. The kids waved from the window as she trudged past snowdrifts higher than their heads. She left the bread on the porch rail and never lingered. Pride ran both ways. Her own children called from Denver, from Albuquerque, from wherever the army had stationed them last. They begged her to move into town, into assisted living, into anywhere with central heat and a nurse on call. Iliana refused. This cabin was the last place Tomás had been whole. She would not abandon it while she still had breath to defend it. The valley itself had changed since the mines closed. Once a string of tidy ranches and prospector shacks, it was now a graveyard of abandoned homesteads. Roofs caved in, windows stared like empty sockets. Poachers worked the high meadows, gutting elk and leaving carcasses for the ravens. The county sheriff drove through once a month if the roads allowed. Most months they did not. That morning the sky hung low and metallic, the color of a fresh bruise. Iliana noticed the shift in pressure the way old sailors notice a dip in the barometer. She split kindling with the hatchet Tomás had taught her to swing when she was 22 and pregnant with their first child. The blade bit clean. The wood surrendered with a crisp snap that satisfied something deep in her chest. She stacked the pieces beside the stove and filled the kettle from the bucket she kept under the drip. Coffee came from grounds reused until they gave nothing but hot brown water. She drank it black and scalding. By noon the first flakes drifted down, fat and lazy. Iliana watched from the window, hands wrapped around the chipped enamel mug. The flakes thickened, swirling into eddies that obscured the pines 50 yards away. She had lived through Rocky Mountain winters her entire life. She knew the difference between snow and apocalypse. This felt like the latter. The crank radio issued its warning at 3 o'clock. Blizzard watch upgraded to warning, whiteout conditions expected, travel discouraged. Iliana snorted. Discouraged. As if anyone up here had anywhere to go. She wound the radio again at 5. The wood stove gulped its last log and settled into sullen coals. The power lines outside hummed, then sighed, then went silent as the grid surrendered. The single bulb overhead flickered twice and died. Darkness pressed against the windows. Iliana lit the kerosene lamp and set it on the table. Shadows leapt across the walls, turning familiar objects into strangers. Her circulation had never recovered from the frostbite she earned the winter Tomás shipped out. Now her toes went numb inside 2 pairs of socks. She rubbed them vigorously, cursing the cold that stole, feeling the way it stole everything else. At 6:30 the radio crackled with something new. Not the automated weather voice but a live transmission, frantic and broken. Mayday, 8 riders. County Road 14. Engines flooded, visibility 0. Requesting shelter. Static swallowed the rest. Iliana's heart stuttered. Bikers. Outlaws probably. The kind who carried guns under their cuts and left blood on barroom floors. Tomás had taught her to shoot, but the .38 revolver had gone with him into the ground. She had nothing but a hatchet and 70-year-old bones. She argued with herself in the lamplight. Let them freeze and you become the monster they already think you are. Open the door and you invite wolves into the fold. Tomás's voice rose above the internal storm. A man's honor is measured by what he does when no one is watching. She hated him for it. The temperature kept falling. She could feel it through the soles of her boots, through the thin mattress when she lay down fully clothed. Sleep refused her. Instead she listened to the wind scream and pictured 8 men dying a mile away. Their bodies preserved like insects in amber until spring thaw revealed them to the ravens. At 8:15 the pounding started. She was on her feet before the first knock finished echoing. The lamp flame wavered as she crossed the room. Through the frost-laced window she saw shapes. Tall, broad, encased in black leather crusted with ice. Beards glittered with frozen breath. One held a flashlight that cut a weak tunnel through the snow. The beam swept across the door and pinned her like a moth. "Please, ma'am," the voice called. Respectful. Almost gentle. "We're not here to hurt you. Just need a wall between us and the wind." We'll sleep on the floor and be gone at first light. Iliana's hand found the latch. The metal burned cold enough to stick to her skin. She hesitated, every instinct screaming caution. Then she thought of the Ramirez children finding frozen corpses on their way to the school bus. She thought of Tomás standing at attention in dress blues, saluting a flag that promised protection to the helpless. She thought of the bread she baked with her last cup of flour. Her fingers moved. The latch slid home with a sound like a judge's gavel. She pulled the door open 6 inches, chain still in place. Wind rushed in, snuffing the lamp. In the sudden dark she smelled wet leather, gasoline, and something metallic she prayed was not blood. The lead rider removed his glove and extended a bare hand scarred across the knuckles. Name's Veda Weeks, ma'am. United States Marine Corps, retired. My people are cold, not crazy. Your roof, your rules. Behind him the other 7 stood in a perfect wedge, boots planted, hands visible. Military bearing in biker leather. Iliana stared until the cold clawed her lungs. Then she unhooked the chain. They entered single file, stomping ice onto the rag. Boots lined up with parade ground precision. Helmets came off in unison and tucked beneath arms. 8 sets of eyes swept the room, catalogued exits, noted the hatchet on the table, and returned to her face without lingering. The last man in pulled the door shut and latched it with the same care she had used to open it. Veda Weeks removed his scarf. Beneath the frost his face was younger than she expected, maybe 40, with a nose that had been broken more than once and eyes the color of winter sky. He inclined his head, not quite a bow. "Thank you, Mrs. Morales," she said. Her voice cracked like thin ice. "Sergeant Morales's widow." Something shifted behind his eyes. Recognition, maybe. Respect, certainly. He glanced at the dog tags on the mantel and came to attention so crisp it hurt to watch. "Semper Fi, ma'am," he said softly. The other 7 echoed it, a low rumble that filled the cabin like distant thunder. Iliana felt the years fall away. For the first time since Tomás died, the cabin did not feel empty. Outside, the storm kept trying to kill them all. Inside, 8 strangers and 1 old woman began the careful negotiation of shared space, shared warmth, and the fragile trust that might keep them alive until morning. The valley would never be the same. The latch clicked shut with the finality of a coffin lid. Snow hissed against the logs like thrown gravel, but the wind's scream dropped to a muffled growl. 8 men filled the small room without crowding it, their bulk arranged in a loose semicircle that left Iliana a clear path to the stove. Steam rose from leather and denim. Droplets pattered onto the warped floorboards and froze into tiny mirrors. The youngest, a lanky rider with a patchy beard and eyes too old for his face, scraped the sole of each boot across the burlap mat Iliana kept by the door. He did it 3 times per foot, methodical, until no trace of ice remained. The others followed suit without being told. When the last boot was clean, Veda Weeks slid the iron bolt home with a soft snick. The sound carried the weight of a promise. No one would open that door again until dawn, and only with her say-so. Veda's gaze swept the room the way a sergeant sweeps a perimeter. He noted the single window shuttered with plywood, the hatchet now resting blade down in its chopping block, the kerosene lamp relit and set back on the table. His shoulders eased a fraction. "Permission to stand easy, ma'am." Iliana almost laughed at the formality, but the ache in her knees reminded her laughter cost breath she could not spare. "Stand wherever keeps the heat in your bones, Mr. Weeks. This isn't Paris Hilton." A ripple of soft chuckles passed through the men. The tension loosened another notch. The lanky kid, Jax, according to the patch on his vest, ducked his head. "Thank you, Mrs. Morales. My mama raised me better than to track filth through a lady's house." Iliana waved a hand toward the enamel kettle still warm on the stove. "Tea's weak as dishwater, but it's hot. Cups are in the crate by the sink." She started to rise, but Veda was already there. "We'll serve lifting
ourselves,
the kettle
ma'am.
with a gloved hand.
You've done
that dwarfed
enough
the handle. Opening the door. He poured 8 careful measures into the mismatched mugs she used for company that never came. The tea smelled of pine needles and desperation, but the men wrapped their hands around the cups like they were gold. Jax eyed the narrow cot against the far wall, its quilt patched from Tomás's old uniforms. "We'll take the floor, ma'am. That bed's yours by right." "Floor's colder than a banker's heart," Iliana said. "I've got extra blankets in the chest. Marines don't sleep on pine planks if wool's on offer." Veda's mouth twitched, the closest thing to a smile she had seen from him. "Marines sleep where they drop, but we'll take the wool. Appreciate it." They arranged themselves with the efficiency of men who had bunked in worse places than a widow's cabin. Coats came off and were folded into neat squares. Helmets stacked beside boots. The room smelled of wet wool, engine oil, and the faint copper tang of blood. Iliana noticed it first on the rider they called Preacher, a broad-shouldered black man whose left hand trembled when he set down his mug. The cuff of his thermal shirt was dark, soaked through. Frostbite may be worse. She had seen the purple-black bloom of it on Tomás's fingers after a winter exercise in the mountains. "Hand," she said, the word sharp as a scalpel. Preacher hesitated, then extended the injured limb. The tips of 2 fingers were waxy white, the skin around them angry red. A jagged scar ran from wrist to knuckle, old shrapnel damage puckered and pale. Iliana's stomach clenched. She had cleaned wounds like that in a Quonset hut in 29 Palms while Tomás held the flashlight steady and told her she had surgeon's hands. "Frostbite's fresh, shrapnel's older than some of these boys," Veda said quietly. "He took the hit outside Fallujah. Cold makes it sing." Iliana was already moving. She lifted the loose floorboard beneath the table and drew out a dented tin box stenciled with a red cross. Inside lay treasures from another life. Rolled gauze yellowed with age, a brown bottle of iodine that had survived 3 moves, a jar of salve she rendered every summer from yarrow and comfrey grown wild along the creek. Tomás had labeled each item in his neat block letters. She set the box on the table and rolled up her sleeves. "Sit," she told Preacher. He obeyed, lowering his 6'4" frame onto the 3-legged stool with the grace of a man used to pain. The others formed a quiet half-circle, giving her room but staying close enough to catch him if he fainted. She worked in silence. First lukewarm water from the kettle to thaw the skin, then iodine that made Preacher hiss through his teeth. She cleaned the old scar with the same care she once used on Tomás's blisters after forced marches. The salve went on thick, smelling of summer meadows and sharp herbs. Gauze wrapped snug but not tight. When she finished, she tied the knot with a flourish Tomás had taught her for field dressings. "Keep it elevated tonight," she said. "No arguments." Preacher flexed the bandaged fingers experimentally. "Yes, ma'am. Feels like I got my hand back." The others watched with the stillness of men who had seen medics work miracles and knew better than to interrupt. When Iliana closed the tin, Veda inclined his head. "Tomás teach you that? On base, between deployments. Said every Marine's wife ought to know how to keep her man in one piece." She wiped her hands on a rag that had once been a dish towel. "Didn't always work." The stove had burned low again, coals glowing like dragon eyes. Jax and another rider, a wiry man with a handlebar mustache named Doc, disappeared outside long enough to raid the lean-to for the last of Iliana's chair legs and a crate of pine scraps she had been saving for kindling. They returned with armloads and a dusting of fresh snow that melted into puddles around their boots. Doc knelt and fed the fire with the reverence of a priest at an altar. Flames leapt, painting the log walls gold. Heat rolled out in waves that chased the chill from Iliana's bones for the first time in days. The room brightened, shadows retreating to the corners where the light could not reach. Veda rummaged in a saddlebag and produced a dented pot and a plastic bag of dehydrated stew mix. "We've got enough for 10 if we stretch it." "Your call, ma'am." Iliana eyed the offering, then disappeared through the narrow door that led to the root cellar. Cold air rushed up the stairs, carrying the earthy smell of potatoes and onions. She returned with 3 shriveled carrots, a handful of jerky that had gone hard as boot leather, and a mason jar of tomatoes she had canned the previous summer. The bikers watched her portion the vegetables with the precision of a quartermaster. "Root cellar's a fortress," Veda observed. "You could feed a platoon for a week down there." "Fed 4 children through lean times," Iliana said. "Same principle." They worked together without discussion. Doc stirred the pot while Jax sliced jerky into paper-thin strips that curled in the heat. Preacher, hand propped on a folded coat, kept time with his good foot tapping against the floorboards. The cabin filled with the scent of simmering beef and onions, the kind of smell that made hunger ache like a bruise. Iliana added a pinch of dried thyme from a tin older than Jack's. Veda watched her fingers, quick and sure despite the arthritis. "You know your wild plants," he said. "That yarrow in the salve grows up by the ridge line. Every summer. Comfort too. Tomás used to say the mountains provided if you paid attention." She stirred the pot clockwise, the way her grandmother had taught her to keep the spirits happy. "Most folks drive right past medicine growing free for the taking." The stew thickened, bubbling softly. Someone produced a sleeve of saltines that had survived the ride, crushed but edible. Iliana set the table with 5 mismatched plates and 3 bowls. The rest would eat from the pot. When the first ladle hit a plate, steam rose like incense. They ate in shifts, passing the pot around the circle. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the wind outside, and the occasional slurp. Iliana tasted salt and smoke and something that might have been hope. When Jax offered her the last carrot, she took it without protest. Bellies full, the men leaned back against walls or stretched out on blankets. The kerosene lamp burned low, its flame steady now that the draft was blocked. Shadows danced across faces marked by sun and wind and choices no one spoke of yet. Jax broke the silence first. "Rode up from Tucson," he said, voice soft. "Thought we'd beat the front. Engines quit 2 miles out. Buried the bikes under a pine to keep the snow off the carbs." "Smart," Doc said. "Carbs ice up faster than a recruit's courage." Preacher chuckled, a low rumble. "Remember that run outside Kandahar? Sand in everything but our eyeballs." Stories unfolded like cards in a quiet game. A night ride through the Mojave under a full moon. A breakdown in the Black Hills where they pushed a softail 6 miles to a diner that served pie worth the blisters. The time Veda pulled a rookie out of a burning Humvee and carried him 3 clicks to the medevac bird. Iliana listened, her rocker creaking in time with the wind. She heard the cadence beneath the words, the way Marines told stories to keep the dark at bay. She sensed the discipline in the way they moved, the way they deferred to Veda without discussion. These were not weekend warriors playing dress-up. Their cuts bore rockers she did not recognize, no club colors, just a small embroidered insignia, a stylized mountain peak over crossed rifles. Veda's eyes never stopped moving, cataloging exits, watching her face, watching his men. A leader's habit etched deep. The crank radio sat on the mantel, silent since the distress call. Iliana wounded out of habit. Static hissed, then a voice, faint but clear. "Ironwood elements report status. Over." Veda's head snapped up. He crossed the room in 2 strides and took the radio with the same care he had shown the kettle. "Ironwood 6. This is Ironwood Actual. 8 souls sheltered, no casualties. Will advise at first light. Out." He set the radio down gently. Iliana raised an eyebrow. "Ironwood. Old coal sign," Veda said. "Some habits die harder than others." The fire settled into coals. Outside, the storm showed no sign of tiring. Inside, 8 strangers and 1 old woman shared the small circle of light, bound by stew and stories and the fragile certainty that the night would end. The valley slept under its white shroud, unaware that the rules had already begun to change. The storm broke sometime after 4, the wind dropping from a howl to a mutter, then to the soft hush of settling snow. Iliana woke to silence so complete it rang in her ears. The cabin smelled of pine smoke and the ghost of last night's stew. Warmth radiated from the stove, steady and strong, as if the fire had never been allowed to gutter. She lay on her cot beneath the quilt of Tomás's uniforms and listened to the small sounds that told her she was not alone. The creak of floorboards under deliberate steps, the scrape of a shovel against tin, the low murmur of voices pitched for privacy. She rose slowly, joints protesting the cold that lingered in the corners. The kerosene lamp had burned out. Daylight filtered through the single window in pale, watery bars. The room was transformed. The rag rug lay straight, boots aligned beneath the bench like soldiers at inspection. The table gleamed, wiped clean of last night's crumbs. The hatchet rested in its block, handle polished by someone's sleeve. Even the enamel basin under the leak had been emptied and set upright. Outside, the bikers moved with the fluid efficiency of men who had trained together longer than some of them had been alive. Jax and Doc balanced on the roof, shovels flashing as they swept snow in rhythmic arcs. The load slid off in heavy slabs that hit the ground with muffled thuds. Preacher, hands still bandaged, worked one-armed at the wall, stuffing fresh moss into chinks with a putty knife he must have found in Tomás's old toolbox. Every gap he sealed was packed tight, then smoothed flat with the heel of his palm. Iliana opened the door a crack. The air bit her cheeks, but the wind no longer tried to tear the cabin from its foundation. Snow lay in drifts higher than the porch rail, the world sculpted into soft white hills that swallowed fence posts and swallowed sound. The sky above was the color of fresh cream, clouds thinning to reveal a slice of pale blue. Veda stood at the foot of the steps, coat unbuttoned, breath pluming in the still air. He raised a hand in greeting, then turned to the others. Sound off. One by one they answered, voices crisp against the snow. Jax present. Doc present. Preacher present. The names rolled out like a morning report. 8 voices, 8 bodies accounted for. When the last man finished, Veda nodded once. Sentry rotation complete. Roof secure. Perimeter clear. Iliana stepped onto the porch, boots crunching through the crust. You run a tight ship, Mr. Weeks. Old habits, Mrs. Morales. He gestured toward the cabin. Your roof was carrying 30 pounds per square foot. Another hour and the ridge beam would have snapped. She looked up. The patches of tin glinted where snow had been cleared. The leak over her dresser was gone. Someone had wedged a scrap of rubber inner tube beneath the metal and sealed it with pine pitch. Temporary, but it would hold until spring. Inside again, the men filed in for coffee reheated from last night's grounds. They drank it standing, cups cradled in gloved hands. Iliana watched the way they moved. No wasted motion, no bumping shoulders in the small space. When Jax reached for the sugar tin, Doc was already sliding it across the table. When Preacher flexed his bandaged fingers, Veda's eyes tracked the motion and relaxed only when the man gave a small nod. She waited until the cups were empty. Ironwood, she said quietly. That's not a club name. Veda set his mug down with care. No, ma'am. It's a call sign. We're what's left of a reconnaissance platoon. 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines. Some of us rotated out. Some of us didn't rotate at all. We ride together now. Keep each other honest. The room stilled. Iliana felt the weight of 8 lifetimes compressed into the small space between heartbeats. She thought of Tomás coming home from his last tour, thinner, quieter, eyes scanning every room the way Veda scanned hers. She thought of the nights he woke shouting, the way he polished his dog tags until the metal shone like a mirror. You kept the discipline, she said. Discipline keeps us alive, Veda replied. Out there and in here. He tapped his temple. Jax cleared his throat. We fixed the bikes, ma'am. Buried the carbs in pine needles overnight. Engines turned over first kick. Iliana nodded. She had heard the cough and roar at dawn, muffled by snow. The sound had pulled her from a dream of desert sand and helicopter blades. Veda reached into his coat and drew out a thick envelope, the paper crisp and white against the worn leather. He held it out. For the food, the wood, the roof, the hand you gave Preacher. Iliana stared at the envelope as if it might bite. She saw the edge of cash, hundreds maybe, more money than her pension saw in 3 months. Her hand stayed at her side. "I opened my door," she said. "That's all." "That's everything," Veda countered. "Out here, a door can mean the difference between a heartbeat and a headstone." She shook her head. "I won't take pay for decency." The envelope disappeared back into his coat. Veda's expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes. He reached again, this time producing a small velvet pouch. From it he drew a silver dog-tag pendant on a ball chain. The metal caught the light and threw it back in a clean, cold gleam. Etched into the surface were the words Hearth Mother in block letters. Beneath them a tiny mountain peak over crossed rifles. He held it out on his open palm. "Then take this. Not payment. Recognition." Iliana took the pendant. The chain pooled in her hand like liquid mercury. The tag was warm from his skin. She turned it over. On the back, 8 names were engraved in microscopic script. Veda Weeks, J.X. Hollis, Preacher Jones, Dos Ruiz. The list went on, ending with a date 3 years past. Veda's voice dropped to parade ground cadence. "Attention!" 8 men snapped to. Boots crashed together. Chins lifted. Shoulders squared. The small room seemed to expand around the sound. Veda's eyes locked on hers. "Your fire lit ours. Our steel guards yours forever." 8 right hands rose in perfect unison, palms flat, fingers tight. The salute held for 3 heartbeats, then dropped as one. The silence that followed rang louder than any shout. Iliana felt the pendant burn against her palm. She slipped the chain over her head. The tag settled against her collarbone, heavy as a vow. Outside, the bikes waited in a neat row. Snow brushed from seats and handlebars. Engines ticked as they cooled. The men donned helmets and coats with the same precision they had shown removing them. Veda swung aboard the lead Harley, a matte black road king with no chrome to catch the sun. He raised a gloved hand. Jax handed Iliana a scrap of paper torn from a road map. On it was a phone number written in block letters. "Satellite phone," he said. "Works anywhere. You call, we ride." She tucked the paper into the pocket with Tomás's old lighter. The bikers mounted up. Engines coughed, caught, settled into a low, throaty idle. Veda gave a single nod. The column moved off in formation, tires cutting twin tracks through the virgin snow. They crested the ridge and disappeared, the sound of their engines fading until the valley held only the soft creak of pine branches and the distant drip of melting ice. Iliana stood on the porch until the tracks began to fill. The pendant rested warm against her skin. She went inside. The cabin felt different. The stove burned with a fresh load of wood she had not split. The table legs, wobbly for years, stood firm on new cedar shims. The door hinges, once loose enough to squeal, moved silent and smooth on screws tightened with a biker's multi-tool. A neat stack of split pine filled the corner where the broken rocker used to lean. Enough for 2 weeks, maybe 3. She touched the pendant again. The names etched on the back were too small to read without glasses, but she knew they were there. 8 men who had ridden out of her life as neatly as they had ridden in, leaving behind heat and order and a promise she had not asked for but could not refuse. The sun climbed higher, turning the snow to diamonds. Iliana filled the kettle and set it on the stove. She would bake today, not just for the Ramirez children but for the empty road that might bring riders back. The valley looked the same, white and silent and vast. But beneath the snow, something had shifted. Roots had taken hold where none had been before. She touched the dog tags at her throat, old and new, and felt the years settle into a different shape. The cabin creaked around her, no longer empty, no longer cold. Outside, the world waited under its white blanket, but inside, the fire burned steady and the door stood ready. The kettle sang its thin, familiar song while Iliana stood at the window, watching the valley breathe again. 3 days had passed since the riders vanished over the ridge, and the snow had settled into a crust hard enough to bear a woman's weight if she stepped carefully. Sunlight poured thin and cold across the drifts, turning every surface to hammered silver. The world looked scrubbed clean, but Iliana knew better. Clean snow hid blood as easily as it hid footprints. She had expected the quiet to feel like before, the hollow kind that pressed against the eardrums and made the cabin feel too large. Instead, the silence carried weight like a held breath. The poachers who usually worked the high meadows had not shown since the storm. No rifle cracks echoed at dusk. No gutted elk hung from the cottonwoods along the creek. The ravens circled empty branches and flew away hungry. On the second morning she found the first gift. A brown paper sack waited on the porch rail, frost riming the edges. Inside, 2 cans of coffee, real coffee, not the chicory sweeping she bought in town, a sleeve of saltine crackers still sealed, a small jar of honey the color of motor oil, and a 5-pound sack of pinto beans. Tucked beneath the beans lay a square of cardboard torn from a cereal box. Block letters in black marker. Grateful Riders. No signature, no explanation. She carried the sack inside and set it on the table as if it might explode. The third morning brought milk in a dented steel canister, still cold from the snow, and a loaf of bread wrapped in butcher paper. The crust bore the imprint of a large hand, thumb and fingers clear in the flour. Another note, same handwriting. Keep warm. She ate the bread standing over the sink, tearing off chunks that tasted of yeast and wood smoke and something that made her eyes sting. That afternoon the crank radio woke her from a doze. She had left it on the mantel, wound tight out of habit. Static crackled, then a voice, clipped and professional. Ironwood 6, confirm hearth secure. Over. A pause, then again softer. Hearth secure. Out. The transmission ended as abruptly as it began. Iliana stared at the radio until the spring unwound and the dial went dark. She began to notice other changes. At dusk she saw lights in the valley where no lights had burned for years. The old Jensen place, roof half caved, showed a steady glow through the broken window. The McAllister barn, doors hanging on one hinge since the last windstorm, now stood square and latched, a thin plume of smoke rising from the stovepipe someone had straightened. She watched through the field glasses Tomás had used to spot elk, but the distance swallowed detail. Only the lights remained, steady and reassuring. Word traveled the slow way it always did in the high country. Mrs. Ramirez stopped by on the 4th day, cheeks flushed from the walk, carrying an empty basket that would not stay empty long. She set it on the porch and eyed the repaired gate latch with open suspicion. Fence down by the creek's fixed, she said without greeting. Posts set deep, wire tight as piano string. Kids say big men in black coats did it. Asked after you by name. Polite though. Tipped their hats like in the old movies. Iliana filled the basket with half her new coffee and a jar of the honey. Mrs. Ramirez tried to protest, but Iliana closed the lid with a look that ended arguments. When the woman left, her footprints crossed others in the snow, boot treads deep and wide, spaced like soldiers marching. That night Iliana sat at the table with the kerosene lamp turned low. She laid the silver dog tag pendant on the oilcloth and studied it the way Tomás used to study maps. The engraving was crisp, the mountain peak and crossed rifles no larger than a dime. Hearth Mother. The words felt heavier than the metal. She turned the tag over and traced the 8 names with a fingernail. Veda Weeks, Jax Hollis, Preacher Jones, Duck Ruiz. For others whose stories she had only tasted around the fire. Tomás had worn a pendant like this. Only his carried his blood type and religion. He had told her once about Chosin, the frozen reservoir where the temperature dropped to 30 below and the Chinese came in waves. He spoke of men sharing body heat in foxholes, of a sergeant who gave his gloves to a private and lost 3 fingers to frostbite. We carried each other out, Tomás had said. Not because we were heroes. Because the alternative was leaving a brother behind. She had been 25 then, pregnant with their second child, and the story had frightened her more than any war movie. Now the pendant lay in her palm, warm from her skin. She thought of the envelope Veda had offered and refused, of the vow spoken in perfect unison. Your fire lit ours. Our steel guards yours forever. Pretty words, But words did not fix fences or leave coffee on a widow's porch. She rose and fetched the scrap of paper from the pocket with Tomás's lighter. The satellite number was written in the same block letters as the notes. 10 digits, plus a country code she did not recognize. Her hands trembled as she wound the crank radio to full charge. The cabin was dark except for the stove's glow. Outside, the moon hung low and orange, painting the snow the color of old blood. She lifted the radio's handset, an awkward plastic thing meant for emergencies. Her thumb hovered over the keypad. Pride warred with curiosity. The same battle she had fought the night the bikers knocked. Pride lost. He dialed. The connection took longer than any call she had ever made. Static hissed, then a series of clicks like bones knocking together. A ringtone, faint and foreign. Another click. Then Veda's voice, warm but alert, as if he had been waiting. Morales residence, he asked. No hesitation. He knew. Iliana's mouth went dry. You left coffee, she said. Came out sharper than she intended. Soft chuckle. Yes, ma'am. Real coffee. Figured you'd earned it. Fence is fixed. Lights in empty houses. Poachers gone quiet. She paused, listening to the faint hum of the satellite link. My neighbors think I've taken up with angels on motorcycles. Angels don't ride Harleys, Veda said. But we do keep our promises. She leaned against the table, the pendant swinging gently against her chest. I need the truth, Mr. Weeks. All of it. Who are you really? And why is my valley suddenly the safest place in Colorado? Silence stretched, filled only by the soft tick of the stove cooling. When Veda spoke again, the warmth was still there, but an edge rode beneath it like a blade in velvet. Fair enough, he said. You deserve that. But some truths are better spoken face to face. Can you give us 2 hours? Iliana glanced at the clock Tomás had wound every Sunday for 40 years. The hands stood at 9:15. Roads drifted shut. We'll manage. She heard the smile in his voice, the same confidence that had carried 8 men through a blizzard on dying engines. Bring your own coffee, she said. Mine's running low. Copy that. See you soon, Hearth Mother. The line went dead. Iliana set the handset down and stared at it as if it might sprout wings. The cabin felt suddenly too small, the air thick with anticipation. She banked the stove, added 2 splits of pine from the stack the riders had left, and pulled Tomás's field jacket from its hook. The pendant settled against her skin, a small, steady weight. Outside, the moon climbed higher, turning the snow to a field of diamonds. Somewhere beyond the ridge, engines coughed to life, muffled by distance and snow. Iliana stood on the porch and watched the horizon, the same way she had watched for Tomás's return from every deployment. This time the riders were coming back. She did not know what truths they carried, only that the valley had already begun to change around them. The poachers were gone. The fences stood. The lights burned in empty houses. And somewhere in the dark, 8 men rode with her name on their lips and her safety in their hands. Iliana touched the pendant and felt the shape of a new story beginning, one written in tire tracks and quiet vows and the stubborn refusal to leave a brother behind. The night was cold, but the cold no longer frightened her. The engines arrived before the headlights. A low, disciplined growl rose from the valley floor. 8 Harleys climbing the switchback in second gear, tires cutting clean lines through the crusted snow. Iliana stood on the porch, Tomás's field jacket buttoned to the throat, the silver pendant a cold coin against her sternum. Moonlight silvered the riders as they crested the ridge and fanned into the yard in perfect staggered formation. Engines cut in unison. Silence rushed back in, broken only by the soft tick of cooling metal and the sigh of snow sliding from fenders. Veda Weeks dismounted first. He removed his helmet and tucked it beneath one arm, the gesture crisp despite the hour. Snowflakes caught in his close-cropped hair and melted instantly. The others followed, boots crunching as they formed a loose semicircle facing the porch. No one spoke. The night held its breath. Iliana broke it. Coffee's hot. Doors open. You ride like you're still on patrol. Veda's mouth curved, not quite a smile. Some things you don't unlearn, ma'am. He climbed the steps, the others trailing at a respectful distance. Inside, the stove threw out steady heat. The cabin smelled of pine and the faint sweetness of the honey she had opened that morning. She had set 9 mugs on the table, the good ones saved for company that never came. Veda filled his without asking, then passed the pot down the line. When every man held a mug, Veda set his down untouched. He reached inside his coat and produced a small leather folder, the kind that held military orders. He laid it on the oilcloth between them. Gunnery Sergeant Veda Weeks, United States Marine Corps, retired, he said. Silver Star, 2 bronze, Purple Heart. The men behind me are Recon Marines, everyone decorated. Jax took a round through the thigh outside Ramadi and kept calling fire. Preacher carried his spotter 2 miles with a sucking chest wound. Doc held a kid's intestines in with his bare hands until the bird came. We don't ride for fun, Mrs. Morales. We ride because the road keeps the ghosts quiet. Iliana's fingers tightened around her mug. The coffee steamed between them like incense. You said truths were better face to face. Start talking. Veda opened the folder. Inside lay a photograph, edges curled from handling. A younger Veda in desert camouflage, arms slung around an older Marine whose face was half shadow. The older man's eyes burned with the same intensity she saw in Veda now. Captain Elias Reed, Veda said. My platoon commander at Chosin. He taught me that leadership isn't about giving orders. It's about carrying the ones who can't walk. November 29th, 1950. Chinese hit the reservoir at dusk. Radio went down. Whole column cut off. Reed sent a private crawling through the snow with a busted Pierce 6. Private's name was Tomás Morales. The name struck Iliana like a slap. She set her mug down hard enough to slosh coffee over the rim. Tomás never told me the details. Said the cold was the real enemy. He wasn't wrong, Veda said. Temperature dropped to 30 below. Frostbite took fingers faster than bullets. Tomás fixed that radio with a bayonet and a prayer. Got the RT coordinates through. Saved 300 men, including Captain Reed. Reed carried that debt the rest of his life. When he rotated home, he looked up Tomás's family. Found you. Told you the Corps took care of its own. You were pregnant with your first. He sent Christmas cards every year until he died. Iliana's eyes stung. She remembered the cards, thick envelopes postmarked Quantico, always with a $20 bill tucked inside for the baby. She had thought it charity. Tomás had never corrected her. Veda continued, voice steady. Reed made me promise if I ever crossed paths with Tomás Morales's widow, I'd square the ledger. I didn't know I'd meet you in a blizzard with 8 frozen Recon Marines on your doorstep. But debts don't expire. He slid a second document across the table. A charter, heavy paper, embossed seal. Iron Hearth Alliance. Beneath the name, a mission statement in tight military prose. To provide sanctuary, purpose, and unbreakable brotherhood to combat veterans suffering the invisible wounds of war. We started with 12, Veda said. Grew to 1,200 across 5 states. Safe houses in abandoned homesteads. Mechanics who fix more than engines. Counselors who ride instead of sitting in offices. We fund it with transport runs, legal, veteran benefits pooled, and the occasional grateful donor who remembers what we did for their kid in a sandbox. Preacher spoke from the doorway, voice soft. Every chapter has a Hearth Mother. Someone who reminds us why we came home. You're ours now, ma'am. Unanimous vote. Iliana stared at the charter until the words blurred. 1,200 men and women who had seen the same dark places Tomás had seen, who carried the same ghosts. She thought of the lights in empty houses, the fixed fences, the poachers who had vanished like smoke. Veda produced a third folder, thicker than the first. He opened it with the reverence of a man handling holy relics. Benefits package, he said. Retroactive. Survivor pension for Tomás's service at Chosin was never processed. Paperwork got lost in the freeze, literally. We found it. $61,000 lump sum. Deposited tomorrow if you sign. Monthly stipend $2,600. Indexed for inflation. Full TRICARE healthcare, no copays. Dental. Vision. The works. He turned the page. Architectural drawings. Crisp lines on heavy stock. Her cabin redrawn. New roof with solar tiles. Insulated walls. A real bathroom with hot water from a tankless heater. A root cellar expanded into cold storage. A widow's walk on the roof with a widow's view of the valley. Renovation starts when the snow melts, Veda said. Crews all veterans. They work for room, board, and the chance to swing a hammer for someone who matters. No cost to you. Iliana's hands shook. She pressed them flat on the table to hide it. And the hearthkeeper roll. $450 a month, Veda said. You bake bread, tell stories, remind us we're still human. The kids in the valley get a grandmother who isn't afraid of motorcycles. You get purpose that doesn't come with a prescription bottle. The room tilted. Iliana felt the floorboards shift beneath her boots the way they had the night the blizzard tried to take the roof. $61,000. More money than she had seen since Tomás's death benefits ran out. Healthcare that would fix the knees that screamed every morning. A bathroom with a door that locked and water that steamed. A salary for doing what she had done her whole life. Feed people, listen to their silences, keep the fire lit. She thought of the envelope she had refused. The pride that had tasted like rust in her mouth. She thought of Tomás crawling through snow with a broken radio. Saving men he would never meet. She thought of the pendant against her skin. 8 names etched so small only love could read them. A sound escaped her, half laugh, half sob. Tears came hot and sudden, cutting tracks through the flower dust on her cheeks. She had not cried since the funeral, not once in 12 years. Now the dam broke and the flood carried everything. Grief, pride, fear, the bone-deep loneliness of a cabin too large for one. Veda moved first. He rounded the table and knelt, one knee on the floorboards the way Tomás had knelt to propose 46 years ago. He took her hands in his, calluses rough against her paper-thin skin. We're not charity, he said. We're family. You carried Tomás. Now we carry you. Behind him the 7 other men stood at ease, eyes shining in the lamplight. No one looked away. Iliana saw Jax swipe at his cheek with the heel of his hand. Preacher's bandaged fingers curled into a fist, then relaxed. Doc stared at the floor as if it held the secrets of the universe. She drew a shuddering breath. I need a pen. Veda produced one from his coat pocket, black ink, government issue. She signed where he pointed, her handwriting shaky but legible. Iliana Morales. Widow of Tomás Morales. Hearth Mother, Iron Hearth Alliance. The pen scratched across the paper like a plow breaking new ground. When the last signature dried, Veda closed the folder and stood. Welcome home, ma'am. The men moved as one. Coffee mugs were rinsed and stacked. Coats donned. Helmets tucked under arms. They filed out into the moonlight, engines coughing to life in perfect sequence. Veda paused on the porch. Bank notification hits your account at 0800, he said. Crew arrives first thaw. You need anything before then you call. Day or night. Iliana nodded, throat too full for words. The riders mounted up. Headlights cut twin tunnels through the dark. They rode out the way they came. Formation tight, tires humming over packed snow. The sound faded into the pines, leaving only the soft tick of the stove and the smell of coffee lingering like a promise. She stood on the porch until the taillights vanished. The pendant felt heavier now, not with weight but with meaning. 1,200 souls scattered across 5 states, and every one of them carried a piece of her hearth. She touched the tag and felt Tomás's hand over hers, steady as the day he taught her to shoot. Inside, she banked the fire and added 2 splits from the stack that would never run out again. The cabin creaked around her, no longer a widow's shack but the heart of something larger. She hung Tomás's field jacket on its hook, the pendant gleaming against the faded eagle, globe, and anchor. Tomorrow the money would come. Next month the crew. Years from now, children not yet born would eat her bread and listen to stories of a night 8 Marines rode out of a blizzard and changed a valley forever. Iliana Morales, 68 years old, arthritis in every joint, went to bed with the taste of real coffee on her tongue and the sound of engines in her dreams. The fire burned low and steady, and for the first time in 12 years, she did not dream of empty rooms. Iliana woke to the sound of hammers singing before the sun cleared the ridge. The valley lay under a thin crust of April snow, but the air carried the promise of thaw, pine sap and wet earth and the faint diesel bite of heavy equipment. She rose from the narrow cot in the Alliance guest yurt, a sturdy canvas dome pitched 50 yards behind her cabin, and pulled on the new wool socks Jax had left folded on the footlocker. The yurt smelled of cedar shavings and coffee. A small propane heater glowed orange in the corner, chasing the chill from her bones. Outside, the renovation had begun in earnest. 2 flatbed trucks idled in the yard, their beds loaded with golden logs milled smooth and numbered in grease pencil. A dozen veterans moved with the quiet efficiency she had come to expect from Iron Hearth men. They wore Carhartt and flannel instead of leather, but the cadence was the same. No shouted orders, just hand signals and the soft thunk of mauls driving pegs home. Veda stood at the center, clipboard in hand, pointing out the new foundation line. The old cabin's footprint had been squared and deepened. Footers poured with concrete mixed on site. The crew worked around the original structure like surgeons preserving a heart. Iliana watched as 2 men lifted a laminated beam the length of a telephone pole and set it into place with the ease of men lifting a rifle. "Morning, Hearth Mother," Veda called. "Sleep okay?" "Better than my cot ever allowed," she said. "You planning to finish before lunch?" He grinned, the expression cracking the fatigue lines around his eyes. "Week, maybe 2. Depends on the weather." She left him to it and walked the site. The new addition would double the cabin's size. A real kitchen with counters at hip height, a bathroom with a clawfoot tub deep enough to soak her knees, 2 small bedrooms for guests or grandchildren who might finally visit without excuses. Solar panels lay crated beside the trucks, matte black and gleaming. A new cast-iron stove, bigger than her old one, waited under a tarp, its nickel trim catching the light like a promise. By noon the walls were rising. Insulated log panels slotted together with tongue-and-groove precision, each seam packed with foam that expanded to seal out the wind. The crew worked in shifts, 4 hours on, 4 off, rotating through the yurt for coffee and the thick ham sandwiches Iliana assembled on a camp table. She had baked the bread the night before in the yurt's propane oven, the loaves rising fat and golden under a damp towel. A VA advocate named Marta arrived in a dusty jeep, her briefcase stuffed with forms Iliana had signed weeks ago in the glow of the kerosene lamp. Marta spread the papers across the yurt's folding table and walked Iliana through the numbers with the patience of a woman who had seen widows weep over grocery money. "First check deposited yesterday," Marta said. 61,000 minus taxes. Monthly starts at 2,600, direct deposit. TRICARE cards in the envelope. Pharmacy in town's already got your profile. Blood pressure meds, cholesterol, the works. No copay. Iliana stared at the bank notification on Marta's tablet. The balance glowed green and obscene. She had never seen 5 figures in her account, not even when Tomás's death benefits came through. Marta slid the TRICARE card across the table, plastic warm from the printer. "Doctor's appointment scheduled for Tuesday," Marta continued. "Orthopedist in Denver. They'll look at those knees. Might even talk replacement if the X-rays agree." Iliana traced the raised letters on the card. Iliana M. Morales. Dependent. The word stung, then settled into something like relief. The medicine cabinet in the yurt filled that afternoon. A courier from the Alliance dropped off a white plastic bin. Pill bottles in neat rows, labels crisp and current. Blood pressure, statins, a bottle of ibuprofen strong enough to quiet the ache in her hips. A smaller bottle held something new. Meloxicam for inflammation. She lined them up like soldiers and felt the years peel back one layer at a time. Word of the renovation spread through the valley the way snowmelt feeds a creek. Mrs. Ramirez arrived with her husband and 3 teenage sons, the boys carrying tool belts that hung loose on their narrow hips. The Jensens came next, then the McAllisters, then families Iliana knew only by the mailboxes at the county road. They brought casseroles and extension cords, and the kind of stubborn helpfulness vanished that built barns in a day. Iliana heard the stories around the site. Tents folded and cached in ravines, coolers emptied into the creek, fire rings kicked apart and buried. No shots fired, no voices raised. Just 8 Harleys rolling through at dusk, headlights off, engines throttled low. The message was clear. The valley had new guardians. Crime followed the poachers into the dark. Mailboxes stopped disappearing. The Ramirez shed, broken into twice last fall, stood untouched. Someone left a note on the general store bulletin board. Iron Hearth watches. The sheriff drove through once, tipped his hat to Veda, and kept driving. Iliana's roll began on a Thursday that smelled of sawdust and coffee. A rider named Boone arrived alone, his Harley coughing like a smoker's lung. He was 29, fresh from a second tour in Helmand, eyes the color of winter sky and twice as cold. He parked beside the yurt and stood with his helmet dangling from one hand, knuckles white. "Ma'am," he said. "They said you listen." She led him inside. The yurt's interior was spare but warm. A card table, 2 folding chairs, the propane heater hissing softly. She poured coffee into a tin mug and set a plate of oatmeal cookies between them. Boone ate one in 2 bites and stared at the crumbs as if they held answers. He talked for an hour. About the IED that took his best friend's legs. About the night he woke with his hands around his girlfriend's throat and no memory of how they got there. About the VA shrink who prescribed pills that turned the world gray. Iliana listened the way she had listened to Tomás after his nightmares, saying nothing, letting the silence do the heavy lifting. When Boone finished, his shoulders were lower, the tension bled out like poison from a wound. She pushed the cookie plate closer. "You ride with Iron Hearth now," she said. "That means you're not alone. You need to talk again, you come here. Doors always open." He nodded, eyes wet. "Yes, ma'am." Word spread through the Alliance network. Every Saturday became dinner night. Iliana cooked in the yurt's small kitchen, pots balanced on a 2-burner stove. She made pinto beans thick with ham hock, cornbread that steamed when broken open, green chili stew that cleared sinuses and warmed bellies. Riders arrived in 2s and 3s, filling the yurt until the canvas walls bulged. They ate standing up, plates balanced on knees, telling stories that grew easier with each bite. The cabin rose around her like a living thing. By the end of the second week, the new roof was on, shingles dark and fragrant with creosote. Windows went in next, double-paned and tight, framing views of the valley she had never seen without frost on the glass. The old stove was carried out reverently and set on a pallet for salvage. The new one went in with a flue that drew perfect, no smoke in the room. Iliana moved back on a Friday that smelled of rain. The crew had finished the interior walls in knotty pine, the grain glowing gold in the lamplight. The bathroom smelled of new grout and lemon cleaner. She turned the faucet and hot water poured out, steaming and endless. She stood under the shower until her fingers pruned, letting the heat soak into joints that had forgotten what easy felt like. That night she baked in her new kitchen. The oven was electric, the temperature steady as a heartbeat. She made 6 loaves of bread, the dough rising high and proud on the granite counter. The smell filled the cabin and drifted out the open window, a beacon to anyone riding the ridge. Veda arrived at dusk, helmet under one arm, a bottle of mezcal in the other. "Housewarming," he said. "Figured you'd want something stronger than coffee." They sat on the new porch, boards still pale and fragrant. The valley spread below them, lights winking on in houses that had stood dark for years. Somewhere a dog barked, then quieted. Iliana poured 2 fingers of mezcal into tin cups. "To Tomás," she said. "To Tomás," Veda echoed. They drank. The liquor burned clean, tasting of smoke and desert nights. Iliana felt the cabin settle around her, no longer a widow's shack but a hearth in the truest sense. The renovation was done, but the renewal had only begun. She thought of Boone's eyes softening over cookies, of Mrs. Ramirez's boys learning to swing a hammer straight, of the poacher camps now just circles of dead ash, of the medicine cabinet full and the bank account no longer a prayer. The pendant rested against her collarbone, warm from her skin. 1,200 souls carried her fire now, and she carried theirs. The valley slept under a sky pricked with stars, and for the first time in 12 years, Iliana Morales slept without dreaming of empty rooms. The mezcal had burned down to a warm ember in Iliana's chest when she finally stepped off the new porch and let the night air cool her cheeks. 6 months later, that same porch wrapped the cabin like a sturdy arm. Its railings sanded smooth and stained the color of dark honey. Hanging baskets spilled petunias and sweet potato vine over the edges, their scent drifting across the yard where a raised bed garden now grew in neat rows. Tomatoes heavy on the vine, basil thick enough to bruise with a fingerprint, carrots pushing green feathers through the soil. The cabin itself gleamed, logs sealed and chinked, windows trimmed in forest green, the new stove's chimney wearing a copper cap that flashed like a signal mirror when the sun hit it. Beyond her fence line, the valley had become something out of an old postcard someone decided to color in. The Jensen place, once a sagging ruin, now housed a young veteran couple and their toddler. Laundry fluttered on a line strung between cottonwoods, bright against the sky. The McAllister barn had been converted into a communal workshop, its doors thrown open to reveal lathes and welders and the steady hum of men building furniture from beetle-kill pine. Every abandoned homestead within 10 miles had a roof that held, a garden that fed, and a family that slept without locking the door. Crime had not just dropped. It had evaporated. The sheriff's cruiser still came through once a month, but now he stopped for coffee and left with a loaf of Iliana's bread. She woke each morning to the soft chime of the solar inverter switching to battery mode, a sound as reliable as birdsong. Veda arrived at 7:30 sharp, helmet tucked under one arm, tablet in hand. They sat at the kitchen table, oak, built by Boone in his first woodworking class, and planned the day. Supply runs to the VA clinic in town. Maintenance schedules for the valley's shared generator. Counseling rotations for the 3 new riders who had rolled in last week, eyes hollow from nightmares that followed them off the battlefield. Boone's teaching a carburetor class at the barn, Veda said one July morning, steam curling from his coffee. Says the kid from the Ramirez place has a knack for it. Iliana nodded, penciling the note into the ledger she kept beside the stove. Tell him to save me a spark plug. I'll use it to teach the girls how engines breathe. Afternoons belonged to the yurt, repurposed now as a counseling space. The canvas walls had been rolled up to let the breeze through, and folding chairs formed a loose circle around a low table that held a box of tissues and a plate of whatever she had baked that morning. Riders came singly or in pairs, helmets dangling from nervous fingers. She listened to stories of lost squadmates, of children who flinched at loud noises, of marriages frayed by distance and silence. She offered no miracles, only coffee strong enough to scald and the steady certainty that someone else had walked the same dark road and kept walking. Evenings filled the cabin with noise and warmth. 40, sometimes 50 people crowded the long tables Veda's crew had built from barn wood. Iliana cooked in quantity now. Pots of green chili big enough to bathe a child, sheet pans of cornbread, vats of pinto beans simmering with ham hocks the size of fists. The riders brought venison or trout or garden produce. The valley families brought children who raced underfoot and emerged sticky with honey. She moved among them, refilling plates, wiping chins, absorbing fragments of stories the way bread absorbs gravy. In August she enrolled in an online peer trauma counseling course through the VA. The laptop, a gift from the Alliance, sat on the kitchen counter, its screen glowing with lecture slides and discussion forums. She studied between batches of dough, highlighter in one hand, coffee in the other. The terminology was new, hypervigilance, grounding techniques, secondary trauma, but the concepts were as familiar as the ache in her knees after a long day. She earned her certificate in October, the digital diploma printed and framed above the stove next to Tomás's dress blues photo. Her body had changed with the valley. The weight she had lost to scarcity settled back into her hips and cheeks. Healthy now, fueled by real food and the absence of constant worry. The meloxicam and new knees, both replaced in a Denver surgery paid for by TRICARE, let her walk the garden rows without the old limp. Energy returned in steady waves. She could bake 6 loaves before noon and still have breath for the evening crowd. Sleep came deep and dreamless, the kind Tomás used to call marine sleep. 4 hours and ready. Video calls became ritual. Her children, scattered from Fort Carson to Pendleton, appeared on the laptop screen in rotation, their faces filling with wonder at the sight of her standing straight in a kitchen bright with new paint. Grandchildren waved sticky hands and demanded abuela stories. She told them about the night the blizzard brought 8 angels on motorcycles, leaving out the parts about frostbite and blood debts. The calls stretched longer each week, the connection steady now that the valley had fiber optic laid by a crew of veterans who called it stringing hope. In the new living room, a small nook had been built into the wall. Cedar shelves holding Tomás's dog tags, the faded marine flag, and a framed photo from Chosin, Tomás kneeling beside a radio, face smeared with grease and snow, eyes fierce with purpose. Beside it hung the silver pendant, polished weekly. Visitors paused there without being told, fingers brushing the glass as if touching a relic. The broader world took notice. A reporter from the Denver Post arrived in September, notebook in hand, camera slung around her neck. She interviewed Iliana on the porch while children chased chickens in the yard. The story ran on the front page. Widow's cabin becomes heart of veteran renaissance. National outlets followed. CNN sent a crew. The segment aired on Veterans Day, Iliana's face filling screens across the country as she stirred a pot of chili and spoke of bread and listening. The Iron Hearth Alliance website crashed twice from traffic. By November, the model had replicated. A chapter opened in northern New Mexico, another in Wyoming. Cabins rose, gardens were planted. Riders found hearths that were not their own but felt like home. Veda flew to both sites, returning with dirt under his nails and hope in his eyes. "They're calling their widows Hearth Mothers," he told her over coffee one morning. "Your name's on every charter." Iliana snorted. "I'm 70 now. My knees are titanium, not magic." "Your knees carried 4 children and a Marine through 46 winters," Veda said. "Magic enough." Thanksgiving brought the largest gathering yet. Tables stretched from the cabin to the yurt, lanterns strung between them like low stars. 83 people filled every chair and patch of grass. Iliana stood at the head, apron flour-dusted, and raised a tin cup of cider. "To the valley," she said. "To the riders who guard it. To the families who fill it. And to Tomás, who started this long before any of us knew." 83 cups rose in answer. The sound of voices blended with the wind in the pines, a chorus that carried across the snow-dusted meadows and settled into the bones of the mountains. Later, when the dishes were washed and the children asleep on quilts in the living room, Iliana stepped onto the porch alone. The valley lay quiet under a thin blanket of new snow, lights glowing steady in every window. She touched the pendant at her throat, the metal warm from her skin. Somewhere out there, 1,200 souls carried her fire, and she carried theirs. The cabin creaked behind her, full of breath and memory and the promise of tomorrow's bread. Iliana Morales, Hearth Mother, 70 years old and stronger than she had ever been, looked out at the valley reborn and felt the circle complete. November returned with the same teeth it had shown a year earlier, but this time the valley was ready. The forecast came over the new satellite radio in the kitchen. Blizzard warning, 30 inches expected, winds gusting to 50. Iliana listened while kneading dough for the morning's bread, her hands moving in the same steady circles they had used for decades. She felt no tremor of fear, only the calm certainty of a woman who had stared down worse and won. The pantry was a fortress now. Shelves lined with mason jars of tomatoes, green beans, peaches she had put up in July, sacks of pinto beans and rice stacked like sandbags, a chest freezer humming in the mudroom, packed with elk and trout the riders had brought in. The root cellar beneath the new addition held potatoes and onions in bushel baskets, the air cool and sweet with earth. She had baked ahead, 6 loaves cooling on the counter, 2 apple pies under cheesecloth, a pot of green chili simmering low on the stove. The cabin smelled of yeast and smoke and the promise of plenty. At dusk she cranked the old emergency radio out of habit, the one that had first carried the distress call a year ago. Static hissed, then Veda's voice, clipped and warm. Ironwood actual to Hearth. Patrols doubled. Ridge Road monitored. You set. Set and warm, she replied. Extra blankets in the yurt if you need them. Copy. Out. She pictured the riders out there. Jack's on the North Ridge, Preacher at the county line, Doc circling the lower meadows. They rode in pairs now. Heated grips and satellite phones, tire chains ready in saddlebags. The valley had its shield. The knock came at 9:30, soft but urgent, muffled by the wind that had begun to scream around the eaves. Iliana wiped flour from her hands and crossed to the door. Through the frosted pane she saw shapes. A man, a woman, a child bundled against the cold. The man's arm was around his wife. The toddler's face peeked from a carrier strapped to her chest. Snow crusted their coats, their breath pluming white. She opened without hesitation. The latch clicked the same way it had a year ago, but this time her hands were steady. "Come in before you freeze," she said. They stumbled over the threshold, bringing a swirl of snow that melted instantly on the pine floor. The man was young, maybe 25, cheeks raw from wind, eyes wide with the kind of fear that came from being lost with a child. His wife clutched the toddler closer, the little girl's mittened hand fisted in her mother's hair. "Ma'am," the man said, voice cracking. "Cars buried 2 miles back. EPS died. Saw your light." Iliana closed the door and slid the bolt. "Names. Corporal Eli Reed, ma'am. This is Sarah. That's Lily." He swallowed. "We were headed to my folks in Grand Junction. Storm came faster than the radio said." Reed. The name tugged at memory, then settled. Captain Elias Reed's grandson, maybe. The world was smaller than anyone admitted. "Boots off," she said. "Hang coats by the stove. Coffee's fresh. Soup's hot." Sarah's eyes filled as she unstrapped Lily. The child, maybe 2, stared at the glowing stove with round blue eyes. Iliana lifted her without asking and settled her on one hip the way she had settled her own grandchildren decades ago. Lily's mittens were soaked. Iliana peeled them off and rubbed the small hands between her own until pink returned. Eli hesitated at the threshold, taking in the cabin. The long table set for tomorrow's breakfast, the memorial nook with Tomás's photo, the pendant gleaming on its hook. "This place. Heard stories. My grandpa used to talk about a widow in the Rockies who saved a platoon." Iliana met his gaze. "Your grandpa had good taste in stories. Sit." They sat. She ladled green chili into bowls, tore chunks of cornbread, poured milk for Lily into a plastic cup with a lid. The family ate as if they hadn't in days. Sarah's shoulders began to unclench. Eli's hands stopped shaking. Lily smeared chili on her cheeks and laughed when Iliana wiped it away with a damp cloth. The crank radio crackled without prompting. Veda's voice, calm as winter steel. "Hearth, report contact." 3 souls, Iliana said into the handset. "Corporal Eli Reed and family. Vehicle stranded. They're warm and fed." Pause, then a soft whistle. "Reed as in Captain Reed." "Same blood," she confirmed. "Rolling now." A-15. She set the radio down and refilled Eli's bowl. "Help's coming. Eat." Headlights cut through the storm minutes later. 8 sets sweeping the yard in perfect arcs. Engines growled low, then cut. Boots thudded on the porch. Veda entered first, snow shedding from his coat, Jax and Preacher behind him. They filled the doorway without crowding, eyes assessing the newcomers with the quick precision of men who had seen every kind of trouble. Veda's gaze landed on Eli. "Corporal Reed. Gunnery Sergeant Weeks. Your grandfather pulled my platoon out of a frozen hell. Looks like the debt circle's back." Eli stood, chair scraping. "Sir. Job's yours if you want it," Veda said. "Mechanic slot at the barn. Pays 25 an hour, benefits. housing in the old Jensen place. It's furnished. Heat works. Pediatric clinic in town's got a doc who owes us favors. Lily's checkups on us. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. Lily, sensing the shift, reached for her mother. Eli looked from Veda to Iliana, eyes shining with something deeper than gratitude. We can't, he started. You can, Iliana said. And you will. Valley's got room. So does the table. Jack stepped forward with a satellite phone. Call your folks. Tell them you're safe. We'll dig the car out at first light. Preacher knelt to Lily's level. Hey kiddo. Want to see a trick? He produced a quarter from behind her ear. Lily squealed and clapped sticky hands. The riders moved with the same efficiency Iliana had watched a year ago, but now it felt like family choreography. Coats were hung, coffee poured, blankets fetched from the chest. Sarah was given the guest room with its new quilt. Eli took the couch. Lily fell asleep in Iliana's arms, thumb in mouth, breaths soft against her neck. When the house quieted, Iliana stood in the memorial nook. The stove cast golden light across Tomás's photo, the young private's face fierce with cold and purpose. She touched the glass, then the pendant warm in her palm. Fire endures, she whispered. Outside the storm raged, but the cabin held. The valley held. The circle turned 1 year to the next. Debt paid forward in bowls of chili and roofs that didn't leak. Iliana Morales, Hearth Mother, 70 years strong, closed her eyes and felt the heat of 800 hearths burning steady across 5 states and beyond. The blizzard could howl all it wanted. The door was open, the table set, and the fire would never go out. The blizzard raged through the night, but dawn broke clear and sharp, the valley blanketed in a silence so complete it felt sacred. Iliana woke to the smell of coffee already brewing and the soft murmur of voices in her kitchen. Eli Reed stood at the stove, flipping pancakes with the careful concentration of a man determined to repay kindness with hot food. Sarah sat at the table, Lily on her lap, both of them wrapped in one of Iliana's old quilts. The toddler's hair stuck up in sleep-mussed curls. Sarah's eyes were bright with something that looked like hope. "Morning, Hearth Mother," Eli said, sliding a plate across the oak table. "Figured I'd earn my keep before the digging starts." Iliana took the plate, steam rising from pancakes thick with blueberries she had frozen last summer. "You start earning tomorrow at the barn. Today you eat." Outside, the riders had already begun. Jax and Preacher worked the snowblower in tandem, clearing a path to the buried sedan. Veda stood on the porch, radio in hand, coordinating the convoy that would escort the Reeds to their new home. The Jensen place waited, stove lit, pantry stocked, a small swing set already assembled in the yard. The valley had done this before. It would do it again. 2 years passed in the steady rhythm of seasons and second chances. The valley became more than a refuge. It grew into a hub, a living blueprint for veteran renewal that drew visitors from across the country. The Iron Hearth Alliance built a retreat center on the old McAllister spread. Low log buildings with wide porches, a dining hall that seated 100, a counseling wing where Iliana's yurt once stood. Veterans came for weekends or months, learning to swing hammers and plant gardens and sit still long enough to hear their own heartbeats. The media returned, this time with cameras and microphones, calling it the Morales model. Iliana hated the name but loved the work. She earned her full counseling certification through the VA, the diploma framed beside her peer trauma certificate above the stove. National conferences invited her to speak. Denver, Chicago, Washington. She stood on stages in sensible shoes and told stories of bread and blizzards, and the night 8 Marines rode out of the dark to change everything. Audiences wept. Veterans lined up afterward to shake her hand, to ask how to start their own hearths. She gave them Veda's number and a loaf of bread to take home. The cabin remained the heart. The wraparound porch now held rocking chairs worn smooth by countless visitors. The garden had expanded to feed the retreat. Rows of corn and beans stretched toward the ridge, tended by riders and residents alike. The memorial nook grew. Tomás's photo joined by others. Captain Elias Reed, a young Veda in desert camo, Boone holding his first completed table. The silver pendant hung in the center, polished daily, its chain lengthened to fit over her thickening silver braid. Her children came home for the first time in years. Maria flew in from Albuquerque with her husband and 2 teenage sons who had never seen snow higher than their knees. Luis drove from Fort Carson with his wife and 3 girls who squealed at the swing set and begged to ride behind Jax on his Harley. They filled the guest rooms and the yurt and the new bunkhouse, their voices echoing off the log walls in a chorus Iliana had almost forgotten. They toured the valley-wide, the retreat center, the barn where Eli now ran the mechanics shop, the Jensen place where Lily chased chickens and called Sarah Mama in full sentences. Maria stood in the kitchen, fingers tracing the granite counter Boone had installed, and cried without sound. Luis hugged his mother so hard her titanium knees creaked. "You built a town, Mama," he whispered. "You built a family." "I just opened the door," she said. The rest walked in. They stayed a week. The grandchildren learned to milk the communal goat, to split kindling, to listen when a rider spoke of sandstorms and silence. On the last night, Iliana baked 12 loaves, one for each of them to take home. The cabin smelled of yeast and laughter and the kind of love that filled empty spaces without asking permission. When they left, the valley felt larger, as if their leaving had made room for the next arrival. Iliana stood on the porch and watched their taillights disappear, then turned back to the work that never ended. On the 3rd anniversary of the blizzard, she held vigil alone. The night was clear, stars sharp as broken glass, the air cold enough to bite. She sat in her rocker with a quilt over her knees, a mug of mezcal warming her hands. The valley slept below, lights steady in every window, the retreat center's dining hall dark but ready for tomorrow's breakfast. She had baked at dawn, cinnamon rolls for the staff, sourdough for the riders, cornbread for whoever knocked hungry. She spoke to the dark, voice low but steady. "Thank you, Tomás. You fixed a radio and started a fire that won't go out. Thank you, Veda, for keeping the promise. Thank you, universe, for sending strangers who became kin." The pendant rested against her chest, warm as a heartbeat. She thought of Eli teaching Lily to change spark plugs, of Boone's furniture in half the homes in the valley, of the hundreds who had sat at her table and left lighter. She thought of the conferences where she told her story and watched eyes light with possibility. The circle had widened beyond her imagining, but the center held. One cabin, one open door, one loaf of bread at a time. In the distance, a low rumble rose. Not thunder. Engines. 8 Harleys, maybe more, climbing the switchback under moonlight. New riders, perhaps, or old friends returning. The sound grew closer, steady and sure, the heartbeat of the valley itself. Iliana smiled into the dark. The fire endured. The door stood ready. She rose, quilt folded over her arm, and went inside to set another pot of coffee on the stove. Somewhere out there, someone needed warmth, and she had plenty to give. The blizzard that had once tried to take everything had instead delivered a legacy. Compassion's flame burned on, passed hand to hand, hearth to hearth. And to anyone reading this, listening from your own cold night, open your door, bake the bread, light the fire. The riders are coming, and they carry more than they know. Your hearth might be the one that changes everything.